Hello everyone, Mike Butcher from TechCrunch. We love Web Summit and they love us. Thanks very much, Paddy, for inviting me here. It's been a long journey from a few years ago when it was only 400 people in a pub in Dublin, so congratulations on a fantastic event. So the panel that we're going to be discussing now is building companies outside of Silicon Valley, going global, being in international tech companies. Perhaps if you could just sit back, there you go, I can see you all. These entrepreneurs are doing things in their own particular way, in a rather interesting manner, and building in very interesting markets. Now, I'm sure you've all read their biographies, but just to recap slightly, we have Noam Bardin, who's one of the founders of Waze, and if you've ever used Waze in your car, you'll be thanking the stars and Noam for getting you around. The mapping app. Maelle Gavet from Ozon, and in Russia, and we'll be talking about the contrast between her business and other big e-commerce players around the world. Junyu Wang from Wanduja. It's a little bit like trying to be a newsreader up here, which is one of the biggest Android app stores in China. And finally, Roger Egan, who from Redmart, which you might possibly characterize as a sort of Amazon Fresh for Singapore. Now, all incredibly different, but the interesting thing about technology entrepreneurship in particular is the similarities as well between the way entrepreneurs think, and even though they might be in very different markets. One of the things I think has been interesting about the Israeli tech scene, which Waze originally came from, was how certainly during the early and mid-90s, the government really got behind technology as an incredible driver of the economy. And many amazing technology companies came out of Israel. I mean, it's been referred to some extent as the startup nation. You guys have a particularly interesting special sauce that you have. God knows what you're feeding your children, but they're all becoming technology entrepreneurs. Many Israeli firms would get to a size and perhaps not necessarily become what we might call the unicorns of today. They would often be acquired, or maybe for a few hundred million or 50 million, or sort of that sort of area, rather than becoming the big global tech companies that perhaps we all know and love. And what I'd like you to talk just briefly about, Noam, if possible, is how you guys got to that point where you really were that unicorn coming out of Israel and eventually, obviously, being acquired by Google.
Well, I think a few things have actually changed since the 90s. And today I think the world is better suited for global brands that do not necessarily have to come from the US. In the sense that the mobile platforms have become ubiquitous, the platforms that give you access to users, the mindset, let's call it that way, of consumers today is pretty much global. And we're sitting here from different parts of the world. I'm sure we all have either the same phone or a very similar phone, and we have very similar apps sitting on our phones. I think one of the challenges, though, is thinking about where you're going. An advantage or disadvantage that Israel has, it's a tiny market, as are Scandinavian countries, as is Estonia. And so you have to think global in that sense, and that sort of sets you up for trying to build a breakout brand and a global brand, because there really is no market to tap internally.
Yeah, so, but in a way, you were answering a local market problem, weren't you? Initially, people trying to get around using your app. But that obviously ended up scaling to being a global thing. Now, what is interesting about perhaps your businesses is that they are much more regional, shall we say. I mean, Ozon, very well known as kind of like, some people call it the Russian Amazon. That's kind of not quite true, is it? Because one of the things that is very interesting about you guys is that you're not only building a fast-growing company and trying to do the kinds of things that Amazon does in Russia, but you also have to build your own infrastructure as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Ozon is Ozon.ru, which is the Amazon of Russia, but we also have a travel agency which currently is processing 6% of all the travel, all the flights in Russia, not only online, but overall, all the flights, 6% of them. And as you mentioned, we also have a delivery company, which originally we built for ourselves, and then realized that there was a huge business opportunity and that we could actually do it in Russia. We didn't need to expand outside of Russia this business for this business to be attractive. So we're building, on top of the Amazon and the Expedia, we're also building the FedEx of Russia.
So, you know, not too shabby. Quite a few little businesses going on there. Now, Redmart in Singapore, you're doing a fresh, you know, vegetables and deliveries in Singapore. Now, what I want to know is do you think that you could scale that globally, or are you really just focused on the Asian market?
Well, we're focused pretty much on Southeast Asia right now. Online groceries is a very difficult business, more difficult than a lot of other e-commerce categories because you have more line items per order and you have fresh food, which can go bad pretty quickly. So you have to build a logistics infrastructure similar to Ozone. In places like Russia or Southeast Asia, there is no logistics infrastructure like there is in the US or Europe, where you can outsource some of the last mile delivery. So we're forced to build our own fleet of trucks and do all of that ourselves. So you have to build a logistics company on top of an e-commerce company. Yeah.
Could you scale that? Would you want to expand your business into the US market, for instance?
I think it would be more towards Southeast Asia at this point. It would be difficult to compete against Amazon Fresh. Yeah. But there's definitely a lot of opportunity for expansion in Asia.
So you're taking advantage of a fast-moving, emerging market in a similar fashion to Ozone. And in China, the app store that you created had something like 400 million installations, correct?
Yeah, installations.
Yeah. Now, what I'd like to know is that you're obviously quite happy with that bit as a business, but what are the learnings that you've got that could be expanded internationally, or do you look at how app stores are run, you know, globally, such as Google Play, etc.? And are you cloning some of their features, or how much originality is involved in your business?
I would say most, and actually that could be demonstrated about our difficulties to tell our stories to foreign investors and foreign medias. So, for example, our first iterations in 2010 was like a PC-based software, actually, although we are a mobile internet company, but our first iteration is actually a PC-based software. And we like to tell foreigners that this is kind of like a iTunes for Android phones in China, but actually that's quite different. And after we launched that product, we get our first millions of users, and every major internet companies in China copy our products. And also, our current focus in recent years is about in-app search. So mobile internet is all about apps, not websites. So search engines should be based on apps. So we started about 2 years ago. We focused on trying to crawl contents outside of different mobile apps, mostly on Android. And Google announced this about 1 year ago. So I think neither of us hasn't cracked the code yet. So it's 100% original, and we're trying to solve a new problems that in the mobile internet. And we are mostly focused in China right now. I think that's because there's a lot of similarities between China and Silicon Valley, actually, like the users' desirability for high quality apps. And that could be demonstrated for our growth in the past 4 years. Right. But there's a lot of difference, like the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So in China, there's essentially no one is using Google Play, and that's not because of the firewall, but because the adapt to local users' needs.
You have to adapt to local needs.
Yeah, so that actually creates a more eco playground for innovators like us to compete with each other.
Right. So let's just expand on that a little bit. Adapting to local needs, adapting to the Russian emerging market, adapting to the rapidly expanding Asian middle class, for instance. Ways, obviously, solving quite a global problem, but scaling internationally. Now, Noam, you wrote a blog post recently that was posted on LinkedIn, was talking about how to approach Silicon Valley as an outsider. when you wanted to enter the US market in particular. And you've got some very strident views on how that eventually, effectively, you're saying that eventually technology entrepreneurs will end up in the valley somewhere along the line, whether they like it or not. Could you expand on that?
Well, they don't necessarily have to end up in Silicon Valley. They'll only end up there if they're very successful. So most of them are not going to end up there. And I think when you think about Amazon, Amazon is the Amazon of the US, right? I mean, Amazon is not a global player when it comes to their core business. And that's just a highly localized business. When you talk about software and you talk about mobile, there really is no reason why any company cannot become a global brand. But yet, most companies don't. And just like if you're going to start a bank, you're going to have to open a branch in New York if you want to be a global bank. If you want to be a local bank here in Dublin, that's one thing. If you want to go global from Dublin, you're going to have a branch in New York because that's the center of banking. Same thing happens with technology. Silicon Valley, there isn't another Silicon Valley. It's a unique place, unique set of infrastructure, and if you're going to try to build a global technology brand, you're going to have to figure out how to do that. And just like Skype did, and Spotify did, and many other brands that are global brands, but you had to make that move.
So, Maelle, you at Ozon, you raised $150 million round at the end of April.
Yes.
Not being in the valley obviously hasn't affected your ability to raise that kind of money, right?
No, it hasn't. Though the weather is definitely a lot better in the valley. But look, I think what you mentioned is really true in the way that if you're a global software company, you probably need to have, in a way or another, a presence in Silicon Valley. But if you're a more, I don't like the word local, but a more national business like Ozon is, or like they are, if you're not a software company, if you're very much in the physical world, because all couriers are not going to ship from Silicon Valley, they pretty much need to be in Russia, then we don't need to be in the Silicon Valley. We need to have a network there, and we have investors. One of them, Index Ventures, has an office there, and so we are in touch with the Silicon Valley through them, but we don't need to. And the other point, I agree with you, though, to a certain level, because at some point the problem is the Silicon Valley, which is an amazing ecosystem, also ends up being an amazing bubble with white guys talking to white guys about white guys' problems. And so it's great, but you kind of miss like a lot of things around you.
What would you say to that?
I would say, without knowing anything about her company, that probably 90% of the people there are white guys.
Actually, no. We have actually 40% women in our company, so no.
I stand corrected.
Well, obviously, I mean, China's a massive market, right? You're solving your particular problems for your particular audience, aren't you? How do you view the technology world from outside the valley? Do you look at the valley as being a strange sort of madhouse?
Well, I actually used to work at Google, and I think the reasons I left Google is I think the local, especially Chinese users, needs is not in sync with Google's global product strategy. Like when we started at 2010, there's already a lot of local users started to purchase Android devices from gray markets. And the major pain point for local users is not the connections, it's not the apps, but most people, they bought a Android device, but they don't have the 3G plan, and they don't even have Wi-Fi access point back at their home. That's 2010. So that's why we figured out that I need to start it from a PC-based solutions for a mobile era of apps.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's one example of the some local user needs might be strong enough to drive a big business, a big product innovations like us.
Atomico, the venture capitalist Atomico, based in London, recently came out with some research that said that the biggest unicorn companies in the next few years will come from outside the valley. I mean, obviously, I would presume that you guys would all agree with that. But I mean, do you think that's going to be the case in Asia?
Yeah, and I would sort of echo what Maelle said about needing investors from Silicon Valley versus outside.
Yeah.
In e-commerce especially, I think it's very local, as was mentioned, and there's a lot of investors with experience of e-commerce at scale. For instance, SoftBank Ventures, which invested in us, was the first investor into Alibaba. They've seen e-commerce at huge scale with very sophisticated operations and logistics. I'd say they're just as sophisticated, if not more so, than some of the Silicon Valley's investors in the e-commerce space, and there's many others like them. So, just back on that topic.
No, Waze was, there was a little bit of controversy when Waze was acquired by Google, because there was a question mark over whether or not the team would move to the Valley from Israel, and in the end, most of the team stayed, didn't they? What decision was that based on?
What decision was it based on? Well, it made sense. I mean, most of the companies in Israel, that's where our DNA is and our culture is, and that's where we're hiring people from. The challenge we had was how do we bridge the gap between having most of the company based in Israel and yet being part of Silicon Valley, the mobile ecosystem. And so that was the challenge we had to solve. And I believe that any company in the ecosystem has to solve no matter where they're from if they're going to be a global brand. And at the same time, you look at many of the local players, whether it's China or Russia or other places, have had expansion plans that have usually not played out. We don't have a global brand like Google or Facebook that's actually sitting not in the Bay Area in the software space. There are a lot of attempts. There's a local player in China who's very powerful. The local player in Russia is very powerful, but the attempts to leave the market haven't been strong. And I think if you look at what happened to most of the local players in the software-only space, the global players do win out at the end. Remember Orca, remember the German networks that existed at the time. But the question really is about what the vision is for the company. Is this going to be a global company or is it going to be a national company?
Maelle, do you think part of the problem is the media? Because so much tech media is obsessed with the Valley. And yet in Russia we have some great tech blogs, but they're kind of largely invisible, I suppose, to the international community. Do you think there's a media problem here, or just perhaps an entrepreneur issue?
I think the media are definitely not helping because they tend to be very biased, and they tend themselves to prefer the weather of Silicon Valley to the weather of Moscow. But in general, I think the tech company tend to be attracted by where the money and the networks are, and the media are just following. Media are following trends. They very rarely create them completely from scratch. So more an entrepreneur and an ecosystem problem than a media problem.
You recently did a deal with a very large mobile carrier in Russia, MTS,
yes,
to put in pickup points. Is there what can you sort of impart to the audience here about these fast-moving emerging markets where effectively you're leapfrogging the existing business models in the West, the developed West, because if, for instance, in London, if I want to go down to my local store, I can, pick something up, or I can have something delivered very, very easily. There's massive infrastructure already in place and has been for many years. But you guys are effectively leapfrogging some of the old models, aren't you, with these ideas around pickup points and things like that?
Yeah, I prefer the idea that Amazon is copying us. I think that's the right way to do it. But yeah, we had this new investor, MTS, which is the biggest telecom operator in Russia, and the reason why we brought them into the company was obviously for the big check that we got, but also because they have this incredible network of stores. They have several thousand stores across Russia. And we ourselves have around 2,000 pickup points where people come and pick up their goods. And we thought that would be for us an amazing step forward, an amazing accelerator to be able to open pickup point in the MTS store. And we started doing that in October. When you see the headlines about Amazon opening stores in New York, testing lockers, I mean, we've been doing that for years. So that's why I say I prefer they're copying us.
When do you launch drones?
We're thinking about it, but I'm not sure. Drones in Russia have a weird connotation.
Drones in Russia have an interesting ring to it, don't they, at this point in time? Lastly, I mean, Noam, your general point of view obviously is pretty obvious, isn't it? If you're building a big cloud company, big tech infrastructure play, then it makes sense to have roots in the US as well as wherever you're building your company from, whether it be Tel Aviv or Moscow or London. What's a sort of a takeaway, would you say, about building outside the valley? Because obviously you started ways outside the valley, building tech companies for international markets from wherever globally, but outside Silicon Valley. What would be your final takeaway?
So I would say one of the big advantages is not having a large market locally. I mean, having a large market creates a very big incentive to develop applications for the market and not for the world.
Right.
And so if you look at, Spotify is a very similar model. They started locally, they expanded to Europe, they expanded to the US, but they had no choice. There's no market to speak of in Scandinavia. And I think the same thing has to do with Israel. So I think that's sort of a requirement on the first side. It doesn't mean, look at Alibaba, right? You can build a phenomenal company that's a national company, and it can be bigger than anything global. But it's very, very much a question of how big the market size is that you're going after. The second really is the vision. What is your vision? Do you see yourself as a global brand? Are you optimizing for the global consumer or for a national consumer?
Well, I'm sure that many of the entrepreneurs here are thinking outside the box as well as outside the valley. So I want to say thank you very much to the panel. Please, could you show your appreciation? Thank you.